So what really comes across from both sides' statements is that both sides are really keen to normalize and stabilize bilateral ties. Close the bilateral relationship for the past 4 years, saying that the standoff should, disengage, de-escalate. Well, the Chinese have disagreed with that, and in the statement as well, they have disagreed with it again. I think it is a positive and important development that the Chinese vice president met with the Indian national security advisor. You also have structural differences between India and China. Those broader differences have not gone away. China still sees India's border infrastructure build-up as a plan by the US to contain China in Asia, so that problem is there.
So a crucial meeting has concluded in Beijing between India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, and China's Foreign Minister, Wang. These two gentlemen, of course, are the special representatives of India and China, respectively, for settling the boundary dispute between the two nations. Joining me now to decode what exactly happened in this extremely important meeting that took place in Beijing is Saheb Singh Chadha of Carnegie India and the author of a recent long-form paper on the 4 years of the India-China border conflict starting in 2020, which we recommend all of you to read. So Saheb, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about this meeting between Ajit Doval and Foreign Minister Wang Yi? What were the big takeaways of the meeting for you?
Oh, I think the first is that both sides didn't release a joint statement. They were separate statements. That indicates, there are differences and not completely eye to eye, but I'll sort of still talk about what were the points of alignment and what were the points of difference. So both sides, what really comes across in both sides' statements, and mind you, the Chinese have released 3 separate statements from NSA Doval's meeting with Vice President Han Zheng, and also 2 from the meeting with Wang Yi. So what really comes across from both sides' statements is that both sides are really keen to normalize and stabilize bilateral ties in light of the 4-year standoff. I'm not going to say in the aftermath of it because it's not over yet. And they are keen to resolve the boundary dispute as well. Another thing that has come across is that both sides have talked about the need to sort of keep the experiences of the past 4 years in mind and evolve confidence building measures so that the situation that happened in the past 4 years does not or can be sort of limited and prevented from occurring again. Now, both sides have also talked about resuming bilateral exchanges in other contexts. They've talked about resuming the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. They've talked about resuming cooperation on trans-border river water data sharing. And it's also mentioned that Wang Yi, NSA Doval invited Wang Yi to visit New Delhi next year for the next round of special representative talks. Now, that's the point of alignment, and I can come to differences.
Right. So, it's interesting that you mentioned this. Perhaps we can get into the differences. Of course, China sort of touting a 6-point consensus. Of course, India not mentioning really a 6-point consensus as formally as the Chinese. Of course, there are different points of emphasis, of course, between the two separate statements released by India and China. Could you break down some of the differences for us?
So you're exactly right. The Chinese side has proclaimed there is a 6-point consensus. While, the substance of the statements might be similar and have overlaps, the Indian side is not labeled it a 6-point consensus. The Chinese side has, and that sort of speaks to their proclivity to, show that there is consensus. China is being flexible, is being reasonable, agreeable, and coming to a consensus with its partners. That's the signal it wants to send out. India has not proclaimed any such thing. Now, the difference is that, the fundamental difference is that the Indian side still spoke about keeping the border situation and peace and tranquility at the border front and center in the bilateral relationship. And, it says, and I'll quote it, it says they emphasize the need to ensure peaceful conditions on the ground so that issues on the border do not hold back the normal development of bilateral relations. So the border is front and center for India, but the Chinese have not said this. They have again said that we should put the border in an appropriate position in bilateral ties and that it should be properly handled, keeping in mind the overall perspective of bilateral ties so that bilateral ties aren't affected. Of course, the context here is that India sort of froze the bilateral relationship for the past 4 years, saying that the standoff should, disengage, de-escalate. Well, the Chinese have disagreed with that, and in the statement as well, they have disagreed with it again.
Mhm.
And so that's really the fundamental difference that is there in the statements.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit also about, now that we have the different statements on the two sides, how well do you think this meeting went in terms of pushing things forward? Do you think that there was some concrete progress that the two sides have indicated? There was some conversation about the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, Nathula border trade, resuming some of these contacts between India and China. Do you think it was a successful meeting in terms of pushing the relationship forward?
Look, I think we should define success and define progress so that we can make that judgment. We know that the dialogue on the boundary question, the special representatives process had been stalled for 5 years. The fact that it has resumed is progress. The fact that the decision maker at the strategic level of decision making, the national security advisor, and of course the special representative, he's both, has visited Beijing is again a signal. And it's progress. It's positive progress. Of course, that the dialogue on the boundary is moving forward, but of course, you have to have the caveat, and you have to sort of be cautionary, because the trend over the past decade has been that the Chinese have liked to use the ambiguity in the line of actual control between both sides, the ambiguity in the boundary question to escalate at a point of its choosing, at a time of its choosing, and create face-offs, create standoffs, create skirmishes, create tension, and keep India sort of focused on the border. So that tendency has been there over the past 10 years. We just need to keep that in mind before we sort of are quick to sort of talk about progress.
Right. If I could ask you one more question, Saheb, on the question of the National Security Advisor meeting the Vice President of China. Some commentators suggested that, look, this was a significant development, a very high-level Chinese political official meeting with the NSA. Some saying that, of course, China showing its eagerness at a high political level to push the relationship with India forward. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you not?
I think we need to wait, because it's not the case that when visits from the Chinese side take place, they don't meet Indian representatives. So when you had the WMCC meeting on December 5th, the chair on the Chinese side had a meeting with India's foreign secretary. So we know that these sort of meetings do take place routinely. But that being said, I do think it is a positive and important development that the Chinese vice president met with the Indian national security advisor. Now, of course, source-based reporting is yet to sort of come out and tell us what was discussed in that meeting, and what was actually even discussed, and what were sort of the things that didn't make it to the statement. What were the issues between the special representative on the Indian side, Ajit Doval, and the Chinese special representative Wang. It's yet to come out really what the differences were, but it is a positive sign that high-level political dialogue, which has been suspended for the past 4 years, is taking place.
Potted history of what has happened on the border since October, when we had Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri announced a breakthrough in the India-China border question with a patrolling deal. What exactly happened then, and what exactly has happened in the last couple of months since that border patrolling deal is announced?
I think, Shashank, if you take a 100,000-foot view of the situation, you can sort of conclude that a limited re-engagement has begun between both sides. And by their own statements, you can conclude that both sides are on the path to a normal relationship, a relationship that has definitely not been normal. You've heard the External Affairs Minister describe it as abnormal several times over the course of the past 4 years. Now, in the aftermath of Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri's announcement of the agreement on patrolling, you had the very next day, of course, the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. That was, of course, a big signal that both sides were satisfied enough with the border situation to actually have that meeting, and it signaled that you wanted to move forward. But since then, several more meetings have happened. You've had the meetings of the foreign ministers, as well as the defense ministers, and the working mechanism for coordination and cooperation on India-China border affairs, the WMCC, which is a diplomat-led group with military experts in it. That group has also met on December 5th. And of course, today you have the meeting of the special representatives. Apart from that, you've had in the statements, both sides have discussed resumption of direct flights, more broader exchanges, visas, the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. So all of that has been going on.
Saheb, if you could break down for us a little bit as well, how things are going to go from here. We had, of course, the External Affairs Minister in a statement to Parliament saying that in the disengagement process has been completed. He talked about the further steps that the two countries will have to take towards a broader de-escalation of the tensions that we're seeing on the border. Where do things go from here now? Now that, of course, we're seeing perhaps this meeting between the special representatives, as you were mentioning, is one step forward. Where do the two countries go from here on out?
So one thing you have to note is that the fact in itself that Ajit Doval has gone to Beijing is significant, because it's the first visit at this level by an Indian stakeholder since the standoff began. The National Security Advisor or the Special Representative is a stakeholder at the strategic level of decision making. So a visit at this level is a recognition and endorsement of the progress that both sides have achieved in resolving the standoff so far. And further, why does it matter? Because when Wang visited New Delhi in March 2022, amidst the height of the standoff, that was a working visit that wasn't previously publicly announced. He met Ajit Doval. He invited him to Beijing to take forward the mandate of the special representatives. But NSA Doval said that he could visit as soon as immediate issues, which were the standoff and disengagement, had been resolved. So the fact that both sides have now taken part in this meeting and NSA Doval has gone to Beijing, that's an important signal, which means that the Indian side views certain immediate issues as resolved. Now, as you mentioned, the EM made a statement in Parliament that the task of disengagement is complete. The Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh and Foreign Minister Jaishankar have said that now both sides need to focus on the task of de-escalation, which is a broader toning down of troops. Apart from that, you do still have buffer zones where you previously disengaged and where neither side patrols at present. But the External Affairs Minister's statement sort of gives the impression that the government's not yet revisiting the arrangements of these buffer zones. The standoff's not yet over. Both sides will also discuss the issue of regular border management and evolving the confidence building measures that both sides have worked out over several decades to ensure that situations such as 2020, such as the events of the past 4 years, doesn't really recur. Now, but the thing is that you still have structural differences between India and China. Those broader differences have not gone away. Both sides differ on where to place the boundary question and peace and tranquility in the borders in bilateral ties. For India, it is front and center of the relationship. For China, it is one part of the relationship, but it would prefer that other bilateral parts, such as economic exchanges, go on uninterrupted. Now, China still sees India's border infrastructure build-up as a plan by the US to contain China in Asia. So that problem is there. China is still concerned by India's deepening relationship with the United States. And China believes in a unipolar hierarchical Asia with itself at the top of that order. And it won't tolerate any sort of challenges to that. And it sees India as a challenge to that. Then lastly, you are moving forward the process of, discussing the boundary question. But the fact is that the domestic political situation in both countries makes it difficult for either side to adopt a very conducive approach to the boundary question, in case it's seen as concessional or weak. And of course, the trade imbalance is still of concern to the Indian side. And I think lastly, I'll say that the External Affairs Minister, on the day the agreement on patrolling was announced, said that, India and China need to work out a new equilibrium. And what's that speaking to? It's talking about both sides working out a new modus vivendi, because the modus vivendi was established in the 1990s, which started with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing. That political understanding has effectively broken down with the friction we've seen on the border in the past decade. So I suspect that endeavor of building a new political understanding is something that India at least will engage in. The last point I want to make is that next year you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and China has taken over the presidency of the SCO, and India has endorsed China's presidency of the SCO. So that means the summit next year will be in Beijing. Will Prime Minister Modi go? That is something that needs to be watched. And whether he goes or does not go will be, to me at least, a signal either way on how the government is viewing the border situation.
Right. Saheb, let me also ask you one or two questions about potential pitfalls and what the two countries will have to work on to make sure that this sort of de-escalation goes through. There have been questions raised by a number of experts like yourself about the question of border infrastructure, the infrastructure build-up, the development of structures and infrastructure that China has put up on its side, of course, of the troop deployments to make sure that its troops can deploy over a period of time. So there's that question, as you were mentioning. What are the pitfalls, if you could lay out for us, of there being an actual de-escalation and some sort of new equilibrium being reached in the weeks and months to come as it concerns the border issue? What are you saying?
When the standoff was at its crisis period in the summer of 2020, the statements emerging from both sides sort of gave the impression that disengagement would be something that would be speedy, that would take place quickly, and you would sort of resolve it. But nobody, I think, anticipated that it would take 4 years. And External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has said this on several occasions, that the process was far more painstaking than it should have been. It took far longer than it should have. So there are absolutely no guarantees, of course, that this process of now turning to de-escalation will be smooth, quick, or at a pace that the Indian side expects it to move at. And yes, you're right. The fact is that over the past 4 years, both India and China have significantly ramped up their border infrastructure. And that sort of raises the question of how easy will it be for both sides to de-escalate. And given that there's this lack of trust between the two militaries, between the two countries at a strategic level, given that you have such a big trust deficit, can you effectively even move back and de-escalate? And one thing I'd like to point out is, in my reading of Indian statements, I've not once heard the Indian side mention de-induction officially. So in the strategic community, while you have the Indian community at least talking about this three-stage formula of disengagement, de-escalation, de-induction, that third step of de-induction, I haven't actually seen in government statements. And maybe that could be a sign that, the hard-fought infrastructure that you've built over the past 4 years, maybe the Indian side actually doesn't want to see it being de-inducted. So I think those are some of the sort of challenges that you'll have to navigate, whether the process will actually be carried out as quickly, as efficiently as India wants it to, and whether this trust deficit, which exists at all levels, not just the military, not just the strategic, but throughout the decision-making ladder, whether that trust deficit can be bridged.
Understood.
And that deficit will go a long way in moving the situation forward.
Saheb, if I could also ask you one final question on some of the domestic politics of this in India. There has been, of course, the opposition parties are, of course, saying that over the last 4 or 5 years, we haven't really seen the kind of debate that we would like, or the clarifications that we would like to see from the government's side on the issue of what's happening on the India-China border. And therefore, it's been much more difficult for people in the strategic community, even in the opposition political parties, to understand what's going on the border. Do you think that's broadly a fair criticism in terms of the what is your sense of the government's handling of the messaging of this crisis? They have not, of course, always been entirely forthcoming with what is happening at the border. Defenders of the government, of course, say that it's a sensitive national security issue and the government is on it. But of course, you also have some sides, even in the strategic community, saying that we would like a little more transparency, a little more clarity about what is happening. Do you agree with this? Where do you fall on this debate? And could you also do you also still believe that there is some lack of transparency on key issues relating to the border and the situation there right now that would help you personally in terms of understanding what's going on the border right now?
Look, I think it is a given point that certain details or details of developments cannot be revealed for operational reasons, national security reasons. That point is taken. But even while keeping that caveat in mind, there is, I think, a little more room for the government to communicate the border situation to several stakeholders, not just to the opposition political parties, but also to the strategic community. And, the strategic community has, of course, raised questions. You had articles. Some of those questions I feel are warranted, but some of those questions I don't think can be answered, as I said, by virtue of operational reasons. Given that there is more scope for messaging, and, when you ask about messaging, there's also this question of, the narrative and who's shaping the narrative better. Is it India? Is it China? I think the Indian government, at least, could do a little more in putting out, the message that, the border situation. Of course, you're saying that it's being handled, but if you look at what the Chinese side is doing, they regularly put out videos from, near LAC areas, and sort of play up its deployments, play up the troop strength, the technical qualifications. I think that is a narrative competition that the Indian government can engage in slightly more.
Mhm.
I think those are my 2 cents. But of course, I'm not in government. I'll say that, uh, policymakers have constraints. So this is my thinking on the outside. And, government's entitled to their thinking on the inside.
Understood. Saheb Singh Chadha of Carnegie India, author of a recent fabulous paper on the last 4 years of the India-China border standoff that I am reading, and I recommend that you read as well. Thank you so much, Saheb, for joining us. And thank you so much to our viewers on India Today Global for helping us track the story. We will continue to keep you updated as and when the readouts of the meeting between National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and Foreign Minister Wang Yi are out in the public. Thank you again so much for watching India Today Global.
Thank you for having me, Shashank.